Helping an aging parent downsize is about so much more than just getting rid of stuff. Because what may look like clutter to you might feel like memories, identity, comfort, or control to them. And honestly, this process can become emotional very quickly. If you're helping an aging parent and trying to figure out what to do next, you're not alone. Hi, I'm Stacy, and welcome to the Aging Parent Guide. I work in healthcare, and I've also spent many years helping my own family navigate aging, illness, and major life transitions. And today, I want to talk about something I know a lot of families eventually face: helping an aging parent downsize. Because whether it's moving into a smaller home, independent living, assisted living, or simply making the home safer, downsizing can be incredibly difficult emotionally for everyone involved. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming this is just about stuff. It's not. For many older adults, their home represents stability, independence, memories, their identity, and sometimes even control. And when you start asking them to let go of things, it can feel to them like they're losing pieces of their life. And I've seen this personally with my own mom. She's moving from a home she's lived in for decades into a much smaller apartment. And emotionally, that's a huge transition. Because it's not just downsizing furniture, it's letting go of a version of life, a routine, a space tied to memories. And that can bring up grief, fear, defensiveness, and resistance. And another thing that made this process even more emotional was realizing we weren't just going through my mom's belongings. We were also going through things from her parents, because over the years, she had accumulated a lifetime of stuff, not only hers, but things she had inherited and never fully let go of. And I think that's something a lot of families experience. These homes often become collections of multiple generations, multiple life stages, and decades of memories. So when you start downsizing, it can feel emotionally endless. Sometimes people aren't holding on to the object, they're holding on to what it represents. You're not just sorting through objects, you're sorting through pieces of people's lives. One thing I would strongly recommend is starting these conversations earlier than you think you need to. Because downsizing during a crisis is much harder. After a fall, hospitalization, or sudden health decline, families are often forced to make decisions quickly, and that creates stress for everyone. Starting earlier gives more choice, more control, and more time emotionally to adjust. Another thing I've learned is that trying to tackle everything at once usually backfires, because it becomes emotionally overwhelming very quickly, especially if your parent is already resistant. Instead, focus on small sections at a time. One room, one closet, one category, and celebrate progress instead of perfection. Momentum matters more than speed. This process can also bring out difficult family dynamics, especially if your parent feels pressured, criticized, or controlled. And honestly, I've had to be very aware of this myself. Because when you're stressed, trying to solve problems, or worried about safety, it's easy to become pushy, frustrated, or impatient. And that usually makes people dig in more, especially stubborn parents. Sometimes your parent may avoid decisions, become defensive, or shut down completely. And while that can feel incredibly frustrating, it's important to remember this process is emotional for them. There are also some practical things that made this process a lot easier for us. And honestly, I wish I had understood some of these earlier. 1, pick your battles. This was a huge one for me because when you're helping a parent downsize, it's very easy to get frustrated. You start looking at things thinking, why are we keeping all this? But I've learned that not everything needs to become a battle. Sometimes preserving the relationship matters more than winning the argument about an object. Not every item is worth the emotional cost of the fight, and that mindset shift helped me a lot. 2, compromise works better than control. Another thing I started doing was giving my mom limits instead of ultimatums. For example, instead of saying, you absolutely cannot bring all these towels, I'd say, okay, let's pick 4 sets. And usually the number I gave her was lower than she wanted, but higher than what I would personally choose. So it became a compromise. And honestly, that worked much better than trying to completely control the process because it allowed her to still feel included in decisions. 3, take photos of sentimental items. This helped more than I expected. Sometimes people aren't emotionally attached to the physical object itself. They're attached to the memory, the person, or what it represents. Taking photos helped preserve the memory without having to physically keep everything. 4, let them tell stories. This is another thing I didn't fully expect. Sometimes when parents are struggling to let go of something, what they really want is to feel heard. So instead of rushing through it, sometimes I'd pause and let my mom tell the story behind the item. And honestly, sometimes that made it easier for her to let go afterward. 5, sometimes the hardest part isn't deciding to let go. It's physically doing it. This was another really emotional part of the process. There were actually times where my mom asked me to physically get rid of a certain thing for her. Things she had emotional attachment to, but knew she probably didn't need to hold on to anymore. And emotionally, it was easier for her if I took the item away instead of her having to physically do it herself. And I think that's important to understand too, because sometimes people know they need to let go. They just emotionally can't do that final step themselves. 6, expect decision fatigue. Another thing I think families underestimate is how mentally exhausting this process becomes, because every object becomes a decision, a memory, or an emotional conversation. And after a while, people shut down. So taking breaks matters. This process is emotionally draining. This is another area where boundaries become really important because helping someone downsize can easily consume all of your time, energy, and emotional bandwidth. And if you're not careful, you can start carrying the entire emotional weight of the process. There were definitely moments where I had to step away and remind myself that this process didn't need to happen perfectly in one weekend. You can support someone without making yourself responsible for every decision and every emotion. Helping an aging parent downsize is one of the most emotional parts of caregiving because it's rarely just about the house or the belongings. It's about change, loss, identity, control, and what comes next. And if you're navigating this right now, you're not alone. I'd really love to hear your experience in the comments because I know so many families are going through this. And if you want more guidance, I also have videos about setting boundaries, helping a parent who refuses help, and knowing when it's time for more support. I'll see you in the next video.